I don't know if I can actually post this on Reddit. Maybe if I'm lucky, it'll slip through whatever safeguards are in place to stop the story from getting out. I can't be sure, but I've still got to try. My name is Trevor Cambry, and I'm 15 years old. I go to Gerard Arthur Public High School in the town of Hampton in Wisconsin, although I can't seem to find it on a map right now. Trust me, I've looked. We all have. Those of us that are left, at least. I'm getting ahead of myself. If I start at the end, this will all get jumbled up, so let's keep it linear. I figure I've got one shot at posting this. Just one. And if that goes to shit, then I'm fucked anyway. So I might as well make my one shot a coherent one, right? Right. Okay then. It started when I was in science class. I always thought that Mr. Wheaton's classes were boring. He was a portly guy who looked really, really bland. Think Pixies from Fairly Odd Parents levels of bland. Every day he wore a gray suit and spoke in a dry, level voice. I used to find science interesting, but then Mr. Wheaton got to me. I don't remember what the lesson was about. My mind was off wandering, because I really couldn't care less at that moment. No, I don't need to be told how important school is. I know. It's just hard to focus sometimes. You get it, right? Anyways, my mind was wandering and I was looking out the window. I could see Mr. Scrivener's gym class outside doing their 5K laps around the football field. And I remember thinking that I was glad it wasn't me who was stuck on that field, putting up with Mr. Scrivener. He was the worst. But while I was staring, something landed on the window. Something big and black. I stared at it, watching as it crawled across the glass. It looked like a grasshopper, but way bigger. This thing was about the same size as a small bird. A few other students seemed to notice it as well and looked at it, but it didn't cause that much of a stir. Mr. Wheaton didn't seem to notice at all, and just continued on with his lesson. But my attention was utterly stolen. A second black grasshopper landed on the window, a few inches away from the first. I stared at it, although neither of the two bugs seemed to do anything. I could see the undersides of their bodies. Their long abdomens squirmed like gross little tentacles as they moved around. Looking at that thing, the word locust came to mind, but as far as I knew, there were no locusts in Wisconsin. But they were a hell of a lot bigger than any grasshopper I'd seen before. Down on the football field below, I saw several students running for the school, and around them I could see swooping black shapes. I leaned closer to the window, watching as more of the locusts pestered the fleeing students. I could see Mr. Scrivener standing on the football field, swatting at the bugs around him. He slowly made his way toward the school. As he moved, it seemed like more and more of the locusts swarmed him. It was almost like watching the poor man stuck in a snowstorm. One of the locusts on the window moved. I saw its mouth shifting. Its jaws opened and closed. And as they did, I saw all sorts of pointed little appendages in them. They reminded me of needles. "Mr. Wheaton?" another student said. I think it was Cassidy Anderson. "Something's happening outside." Other students diverted their attention to the window. In mere moments, the number of locusts had doubled, if not tripled. We watched as Mr. Scrivener tried to flee from them. I'll admit I chuckled a little bit when he fell down and started swatting at the bugs as they crawled all over him. I wasn't the only one who found it funny. "What is this?" Mr. Wheaton said dryly. He sounded disinterested, and only watched as Mr. Scrivener's movements got weaker and weaker. "Wait, is he hurt?" Cassidy asked. "He's not getting up." "I think he's bleeding," said someone else. Albert Fontessa, from the sounds of it. "Holy shit, he is bleeding. I think they're biting him." "Albert, language," Mr. Wheaton said, although I heard a little more concern in his voice, and my heart was starting to race as I realized that Albert was right. Mr. Scrivener wasn't getting up, and even from the second floor I could see the blood trickling down from his arms as the locusts engulfed him. More of those ugly black bugs landed on the window. Some of them flew away, but there were clearly more of them than there had been a few minutes ago. We could see other students running for the doors, and some of them weren't making it. Way too many of them fell to the ground. "Jesus Christ, we gotta help him," Albert said. "Those things are hurting him." Albert was off like a shot before Mr. Wheaton could protest. I watched him go before I sprinted after him, too. I didn't think that Albert actually had a plan. Pure panic had already set in. We didn't know what we were up against. We just knew that people were getting hurt. Albert ran to the doors, and I was behind him. I spotted a number of other students watching the attack from the windows, but none of them did anything. I didn't know why. "Out of the way," Albert said. "Come on, move it, move it." "What are you doing?" I heard a girl ask as she tried to push Albert away from the doors. "You'll let them in." "We can't just leave him out there." Looking out the windows now, it almost looked like some sort of snowstorm out there. I'd never seen so many bugs in my life. How they'd multiplied so fast or where they'd come from, I had no idea. All I could do was look on in horror. "Albert," I called. "Dude, wait, maybe you shouldn't..." But Albert wouldn't listen. He pushed the girl away, and when two guys tried to stop him, he slipped past them and threw the door open before stumbling out into the swarm. As he did, though, a few errant locusts slipped in. One of them made a beeline for the girl he'd pushed and landed on her arm. She let out a scream of terror, then of pain. "Shit, shit, shit, get it off, it's biting me!" She swatted it, crushing it against her skin as some of the other students by the door did the same with their locust attackers. I stayed back and stumbled back into the hall. I looked out through the window and watched as Albert collapsed in the middle of a desperate attempt to swat the locusts away from him. I saw him curling into a ball and covering his head as they swarmed him, almost covering him completely. And as I watched, I realized that I could hear him screaming. They were biting him. Oh God, oh fuck," the bitten girl mumbled as she ran past me. I saw blood running down her arm from where she'd been bitten. She vanished down the hall, and I had half a mind to do the same. Looking back at the doors again, though, I saw that the locusts had almost covered them, almost as if they'd swarmed toward them. "Jesus Christ," said a boy who was around my age. He nursed a few bite spots on his arms, and I could see one on his neck. Blood trickled out of his open wounds. "They smell the blood," another boy said. "They're fucking coming for us. Come on, go, go." They both sprinted off down the hall, and I wasn't obliged to stay any longer either. I ran with them. As I did, I heard screaming in one of the classrooms I passed. It was enough to make me stop and look. I looked through the window, although I didn't see much. Black locusts covered the window, and maybe that was a mercy. The screams inside were of pain and horror. There were people dying in that room. I took a step back and started to run again. I heard other screams from down the hall, and looked back to see the classroom door open. Someone had stumbled out and collapsed a few steps away from the door. I couldn't see a single feature on them. All I saw was the black locusts covering their body, sucking the blood out of them. And I wasn't crazy enough to try to help them. I didn't know where I was trying to go. Instead, I saw a bunch of other students fleeing into a classroom, and I followed them. It was one of the central rooms. No windows. I could hear screams of pain and terror, and before the doors closed behind me, I saw black locusts beginning to fill the halls. The classroom that I ended up in wasn't one I'd been in before. I could see one of the VPs, Mrs. Anderson, standing with Mr. Wheaton and a few other teachers I didn't recognize. In the back of my mind, I was a little happy to see that the people in my class seemed to have made it to safety. The gravity of the situation hadn't fully impacted me yet. I knew that other students were dead, but the truth of it didn't hit me. Not all at once. "Trevor," Mr. Wheaton said the moment he saw me. He came closer and quickly began looking me over for bites. "You had no cause to run off like that. That was completely unacceptable," he scolded, and I wasn't in any position to argue. "Where's Albert? Didn't you run off with him?" "Albert ran outside," I stammered. I think they got him." Mr. Wheaton's expression changed. The usually stoic teacher looked genuinely shocked, then upset. "Oh," he said quietly and paused for a moment. "At least you're safe. Just after you left, they started... the window cracked." "They were biting the fucking window," Cassidy Anderson snapped. "I saw the mouth parts moving. They were jabbing it. They bit through the fucking window." "Language, Cassidy," Mr. Wheaton said, and anxiously looked over at Vice Principal Anderson. It wasn't a secret that she was Cassidy's mother. Mrs. Anderson wasn't focused on us at that moment, though. She was speaking with some of the other teachers. I could see cell phones in their hands. "Are you calling for help?" I asked Mr. Wheaton. "We're trying. As far as I can tell, none of us have a signal," Mr. Wheaton said. "We're not sure if the locusts are blocking it or if something else going on." "How would locusts block a cell phone signal?" Cassidy asked. That doesn't sound possible. I don't know, but we're exploring every avenue, Mr. Wheaton said. We just need to stay calm and stay put. Stay put? Asked another boy. He wasn't part of Mr. Wheaton's class, but I had seen him around before. Preston Rancourt. We weren't friends and barely knew each other. He had a reputation for his temper, though. He was a scrawny white kid with brown hair. He was the sort of pseudo-rich, trashy asshole who thought he was all that and a bag of chips. The world revolved around him and him alone. What if we're stuck in here? He cried. Is anyone even coming? What if the bugs get them? We're trying to figure that out, Mr. Wheaton said. Please, just stay calm. We should make a run for it, Preston said. I saw my friend Jeremy get into his car. He drove off as soon as the bugs showed up. Did you see the things out there? Cassidy asked. Did you see what they were? Did you see how many of them there were? We're not letting you run out there, Mr. Wheaton said. Well, we can't stay in here either, Preston argued. The ruckus he'd caused had drawn Mrs. Anderson's attention. She pushed through the throng of scared teenagers toward Preston and Mr. Wheaton. We're not staying here, she said. The gym is down the hall. We think it's secure. We're going to try and make a run for it. There's more room there, so we could hold up better. Isn't there a skylight in there? I asked. Wouldn't the locusts be able to get in? The skylight is a lot thicker, Mrs. Anderson said. We'll be safer in there. I'm not going if there's a window, I heard another student, George Wiley, say. They'll fucking break through. They did it in my class. Language, Mr. Wheaton snapped. Oh, just shut the fuck up, you boring old fuck, Preston replied. Who gives a fuck about language? There's huge fucking bugs killing people. And we all need to stay the hell away from them, Wiley said. Exactly, Preston snapped. We need to focus on getting out of here. Getting out of here? No, I'm staying here, Wiley replied. I'm not gonna fuck around with those things. We're waiting it out in here. There's no fucking room for us in here, Preston snapped. Boys, enough, Mrs. Anderson said. Enough. We can't stay in here. We'll be safer in the gym. The glass is thicker and the bugs won't be able to get in. We'll wait and see if they thin out. If we move fast, if we run, then we can make it. What about the cars? Preston asked. They're too far, Mrs. Anderson said. We're still safest inside the school. Preston grimaced like an angry, pouting child. I could see the gears in his mind working as he glared at Mrs. Anderson. Are you fucking stupid? You're gonna leave us stuck here, he said. They're gonna get us. We're gonna fucking die. You do not speak to me in that tone, Mrs. Anderson said sternly. She sounded like a parent. I am still the adult in this situation. Just because we're in an emergency doesn't mean you can start calling the shots, Preston. Preston just continued to glare, before suddenly he lashed out. He threw a punch and was about to go in for a second one when I saw a bunch of other students grabbing him and pulling him away from Mrs. Anderson. Mom? I heard Cassidy yell as she rushed over to her mother's side. Mrs. Anderson had a look of utter shock on her face. Sarah, are you all right? Mr. Wheaton asked. I'm fine, Jonah, she murmured before glaring at Preston. She shook her head before storming off with Cassidy in tow behind her. I'm not fucking dealing with this, Preston snapped before pushing the other students off of him. I'm not gonna fucking die in the gym. Fuck this and fuck you. He went for the door. Preston, don't, I heard Wiley shout as he opened the door. Mr. Wheaton was reaching out to grab him and stop him, but he was too late. Preston threw open the door and slid out into the hall. A few of the black locusts took his place, and the closest students immediately set on killing them. I saw Mr. Wheaton smacking at one on his arm, and I saw another flying towards me. I swatted it out of the air and watched it hit the ground. I crushed it under my foot before it could fly away. Stupid fucking kid, Mr. Wheaton said under his breath as he crushed the locust on his arm. I'd never heard him swear before. Let him go, Mrs. Armstrong said. That's his choice. Did we get all the locusts? They're dead, I called. Good. Thank God. Mrs. Anderson sighed before finding a place to sit. She rubbed at her jaw where Preston had hit her, and things quieted down for a bit after that. We sat in that room for hours, listening to the sounds of locusts outside. Most of the other students in the room tried desperately to send some sort of message asking for help, but no one had gotten anything through. A lot of phones had already died trying. The screams in the hallways subsided, and a few people had donated sweaters or pieces of clothing to cover the bottom of the door and keep any of the bugs from pushing into the room. There was a small wire-reinforced window on the door that the locusts couldn't get through, and through it we could see the fading daylight in the halls and the buzzing insects. By the time the sun started to go down, there were less of them than there'd been before. It seemed as if they lost interest in the school and were finally taking their leave. I heard a few whispers about making a run for the gym, but honestly, we had no idea if the gym was even safe. By the time the hall started to get dark, though, I heard Mrs. Anderson and Mr. Wheaton discussing leaving with the other teachers.
"This might be the best window we get," Mr. Wheaton said. "There's less of them. We can make a go of it."
"And what if they come back the second we're out in the open?" another teacher asked. I didn't recognize her. "Just because we can't see them doesn't mean they're not out there." "No, Jonah's right," Mrs. Anderson said. "We should make a run for it now. We'd be safer that way. It's 3 minutes to get to the gym. We can last 3 minutes, can't we?" "Assuming the gym is as safe as we think," the other teacher said.
"That glass is thick, Clara. It'll be fine," Mr. Wheaton said. "Trust me on this."
"Look, all I'm saying is I saw those things bite through the windows in my class. Bite through it. Those mouths of theirs just started nibbling at the glass and it started to crack. Oh God. I'm missing students." "There was nothing you could have done, Clara. There's nothing any of us could have done. There's no precedent for this. I'm just as scared as these kids are," Mrs. Anderson whispered before glancing at the other students. I saw her looking at me before she looked back at Clara. "But we need to go where there's the most room. The gym is the best bet, I promise."
"Maybe we can pick up others along the way. There's probably people in there too," Mr. Wheaton added. "It'll be safe."
Clara didn't look convinced, but still she reluctantly nodded.
"Right, okay. We'll give it a go."
Mrs. Anderson and the teachers continued talking for a little while longer before making their announcement. "All right, students, listen up," she said. "There seem to be fewer bugs out there right now, so we're going to make a move for the gym." "I'm not," Wiley said. "I'm staying in here where it's safe." A few other students murmured in agreement with him. Mrs. Anderson paused before sighing. "All right, anyone who chooses to stay can stay. We'll send someone back for you once this all clears up. But if you're staying, you cannot open the door until this is all over." "That's fine by me," Wiley said. "You guys have fun out there." Mrs. Anderson moved to the front of the classroom, while Wiley and his supporters stayed near the back. Most of the people in the room wanted to make a run with Mrs. Anderson. I was with her, of course. That room was cramped, and I figured that staying with an adult might be the safest bet. Even if she was scared, I still believed that Mrs. Anderson would know what to do. I was sure of it. She looked through the window, watching the bugs in the halls. They looked mostly clear, save for a number of stragglers. "When I open this door, you run," she said, looking back at us. "Everyone needs to run. Go straight for the gym. Don't stop for anything. If they bite you, just keep going." I saw a few students hesitate. I saw at least one back away from Mrs. Anderson's group to join Wiley's.
"And make sure to close the door on your way out," Mr. Wheaton said. "Okay, is everybody ready?"
Mrs. Anderson grimaced before gripping the doorknob. She took a deep breath and let us all prepare ourselves for what was to come. Then she opened the door and let the first students out. In mere moments, I was back in the hall, running amongst a crowd. I saw the locusts scatter away from us, probably out of surprise. It bought us some time, at least. The hall seemed empty, save for the dark shapes of a few unfortunate corpses. I tried not to look at those or think about what they were. Cassidy Anderson was just ahead of me, and I saw Mr. Wheaton beside her. I could hear the flapping of the locust wings as they scattered, then the scream of pain as someone was bitten. The realization that there was blood to be drank seemed to draw the locusts toward us. I saw them coming in the pale orange light through the windows. Black shapes that flew into our fleeing crowd. I felt a pain in my arm, like I'd just been stabbed, and saw one of the locusts on me. I crushed it, and as I did, another student shoved me out of the way. I hit the ground and felt more of those agonizing bites all over my skin. Dear God, did they hurt. Every single one of them burned white hot, and I heard someone screaming. It took a few moments before I realized that it was coming from me. "Trevor," I heard Mrs. Anderson say. I felt her hand slapping at me, forcing the locusts off of me before she hoisted me to my feet. She'd abandoned her high heels in the classroom and ran in just her nylon stockings. I could barely react as she pulled me toward the group of running students. The first of them were just down the hall, just at the first door to the gym. I saw Mr. Wheaton reaching out to pull the gym door open. He started to run in before freezing up. Even from down the hall, I could see his eyes go wide with horror before the black shapes of countless locusts swarmed onto him. He swatted at them and stumbled backwards, but they were already biting at him. One errant swipe knocked the glasses from his face, and he started to scream with a deep terror that I had never expected to exist in someone like him. "They broke the skylight!" I heard Clara yelling. "Oh God, they broke the skylight!" Everyone quickly dissolved into utter chaos. Most of the students turned to run, but I could see more and more of the locusts billowing out of the gym door like a thick black cloud. "Cassidy!" Mrs. Anderson cried as she left me to run into the crowd. I understood. She needed to find her daughter first. I couldn't see her from where I stood, but I wasn't really looking. No, I was looking at Mr. Wheaton, who was quickly engulfed in the swarm. I watched him barrel forwards, letting out choked screams as he tried to escape. I looked at him in horror as he clutched at his bleeding throat. I could see blood trickling down from where one of his eyes had been. The smushed remains of the locust that had taken it from him still twitched against his cheek, and I could see the wiggling abdomen of 2 other bugs protruding from his mouth. Mr. Wheaton made it an impressive 2.5 steps before he collapsed, and let the bugs take him. I saw Mrs. Anderson amongst the other students, as the locusts came for them. She pushed one student away before reaching down to try to pick someone up from the ground. I almost turned and left her, but against my better judgment, I still went after her. She'd helped me. She'd been trying to maintain order. I owed her that much, didn't I? Most of the students ran past me, and Mrs. Anderson was beginning to swat at the locusts as they came for her. I saw Cassidy on the ground in front of her, clearly unconscious. I figured she'd been knocked down by the running students. Had they run her over in their bid for escape? Mrs. Anderson was trying to drag her to safety and swat the bugs off of her. I reached her side and grabbed Cassidy's arm, helping Mrs. Anderson drag her away. "No," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "No." I spotted a girl's bathroom to our left, and dragged Cassidy toward it. I felt a familiar white-hot pain as several of the locusts bit into me, but Mrs. Anderson and I made it to the bathroom and stumbled inside, dragging Cassidy behind us. I slammed the door shut and began to swat at the locusts that clung to me. A few of them buzzed around the bathroom, clearly confused. "The fuck?" I heard someone else yell, and from the corner of my eye, I noticed Preston striking down one of the locusts before crushing it. "This is my bathroom," he yelled. "Get the fuck out!" "Shut up," Mrs. Anderson growled. As Preston and I dealt with the last of the locusts, she focused on her daughter. "Come on, baby. Wake up. Wake up, please." Blood trickled from numerous bites on Cassidy's arms and neck. Looking at her, I was beginning to fear for the worst. I watched as Mrs. Armstrong checked her daughter's pulse, then checked to see if she was breathing. "No, no, no, Cass, baby, no, no. Come back to me, sweetheart. No, please, God, no." I could see the tears streaming down her cheeks. Preston watched in silence from the far side of the bathroom before looking at me. He didn't look upset, but he didn't look as frustrated anymore. Truth be told, I wasn't sure what he was thinking. "No, no, no." Mrs. Anderson's words dissolved into pained sobs as she rested her head on Cassidy's chest. Cassidy didn't move. She didn't wake up, and she didn't breathe. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Anderson," I said softly. She didn't acknowledge me. Preston just shook his head and sat on the counter. "So, you tried to make it to the gym, huh?" he asked. "Yeah," I replied. "They broke the glass," he said. "When I couldn't make it to the doors, I tried the gym instead. There were too fucking many of them. I had to get to the gym to hide. They got in about an hour ago. As far as I can tell, I'm the only one who got out." "There were people in there?" I asked. He nodded. "Yep, a lot. I told them we needed to go for the cars. We'd probably have made it if we all went together. Safety in numbers, right? They're just a bunch of shitty bugs. If we were all together, we would have made it. As soon as everything went to shit, though, I got out of there and hid in here. Not the first, either." He nodded towards one of the stalls, and my eyes followed where he'd went. My stomach turned as I saw a shoe and a bloody leg sticking out of the stall. "She was here when I got here," Preston said. "I guess she bled out. Those bites take a while to stop bleeding." I looked at my arm, and sure enough, I could see it was still bleeding. Preston ripped up a paper towel and tore it into smaller shreds. It's something in the bite, I think. It stops you from scabbing like a leech. I hadn't realized just how many bites I'd sustained. I was bleeding all over, and I let Preston help me clean myself up. He glanced at Mrs. Anderson behind me, but didn't make a move toward her yet. I was thinking of making a run for the kitchen or the cafeteria, he said. But I don't know. I think they're everywhere. I'm not so sure I want to fuck with them again. Me neither, I said. I looked back at Mrs. Anderson, who was sitting against the door now. Cassidy's head cradled in her lap. She looked up at us, tears in her eyes. The gym was supposed to be safe, she murmured. For a while it was, Preston said. I was watching them on the skylight. There were so many of them. They were like one thing moving together. Like they were all thinking the same thing. Hive mind, Mrs. Anderson said quietly. It's a hive mind. They know we're in here, so they all work together to get at us. She wiped the tears from her eyes before looking down at the corpse of her daughter. We're food. They'll do whatever they have to get at us. I picked up the paper towels and went over to Mrs. Anderson before crouching down beside her. She'd gotten bitten just as badly as I had, and she didn't resist when I started cleaning her wounds. She just stroked Cassidy's hair. And we're not getting the fuck out of here, Preston murmured. We're fucked, man. We're stuck here until somebody fucking comes for us. Because those things kill. Mrs. Anderson flinched as if she'd just been struck. Preston paused before shaking his head and retreating to the far side of the bathroom again. We spent the night in that bathroom. Preston slept under the sinks. I slept in a stall, trying to keep myself out of the stall with the dead girl. Mrs. Anderson didn't leave her daughter's side. She stayed there, cradling her and quietly crying as she sat up against the door. When I woke up, I could smell the dead girl in the next stall over starting to rot. Preston was laying under the sinks, playing something on his phone, and Mrs. Anderson looked like she was still asleep. Cassidy's body was still in her lap. I sat up. My body was stiff and I retched at the smell. Nasty, right? Preston asked. I glanced at him and he just shook his head. Putrefaction, he said. The whole school probably fucking stinks now. It's 10, by the way. I haven't heard anything outside, just the buzzing. Putrefaction doesn't take place until days later, Mrs. Anderson said softly. There was a slight groan of exhaustion in her voice. About a week. My husband, he worked in forensics. You ever see anything like this? Preston asked. Mrs. Anderson scoffed. No. I don't think there's ever been anything like this before. I don't even know what the fuck this shit is. I don't even know if anyone's coming. I had a bit of a phone signal earlier, Preston said, getting out from under the sink. I tried to send a message, but nothing made it out as far as I can tell. It can't be the bugs, Mrs. Anderson said. I think there's something else. I don't know what, but something else is blocking our outgoing signals. Like what? I asked. I don't know. I was thinking about that last night. Those locusts, they're not native to here. I've never heard of blood-sucking locusts before in my life. And I can't imagine an invasive species would hit us this hard. There's too many of them. And they're more aggressive than anything else I've ever seen. I don't think they're natural. Well, then what the hell are they? Preston asked. Aliens? An escaped government experiment or something? I don't know, Mrs. Anderson snapped. I just don't fucking know. Preston scoffed before looking down at Cassidy's body. He turned away before sitting down on the sinks again. He took out his phone and began tinkering with it. Mrs. Anderson was still holding the body close, and I could tell from her face that she'd been crying. I didn't blame her. We should get the bodies out of here, Preston said, looking at the dead girl in the stall. They're stinking up the place. Trevor, you gonna help? Huh? The bodies, Preston said. He set his phone down. We're gonna be here for a while. And it sounds quieter out there. We could probably suffer a few bites, enough to get that girl out of here at least. I saw Mrs. Anderson tense up and hold Cassidy closer. Yeah, I murmured. Yeah. I slowly made my way toward the stall with the dead girl. I didn't want to look at her, but I had a feeling that I didn't really have a choice. The dead girl lay slumped between the wall and the toilet. Her eyes were half closed and her mouth hung partially open. I didn't want to touch her, but Preston pushed past me. "You grab one end, I'll grab the other," he said, reaching down to grab the girl by the legs. She seemed stiff as he began to drag her across the floor. He needed to force her out of her corner, and she didn't seem to shift from the position she died in. Rigor mortis, I think it was called. "Help me out," Preston said, and I finally moved. Together, we half dragged, half carried the dead girl to the door. Mrs. Armstrong scooted out of the way, carrying Cassidy's body as she went, and watched us wearily as we headed for the door. Preston opened it just a crack and peeked out before quickly closing it. "Coast is clear. Kinda, I guess. Not a lot of them out there. Let's do this." He pulled the door open, and we half dragged, half threw that dead girl into the hallway. The door was opened and closed before any of the locusts could get in, but I thought I saw a few of them going for the body. "All right, now the other one," Preston said. "No," Mrs. Armstrong said. "No, not Cassidy. Not yet." "She's stinking this place up," Preston said. "She's dead, lady." "I know. I'm not throwing her out to those things. No fucking way." Preston took a step toward her, but I put a hand on his shoulder. "Dude, she just lost her daughter." Preston pulled away from me. "So? Do you know how much longer we're going to spend in here? Maybe days. Do you want to spend days in here with a corpse?" "She has a name," Mrs. Anderson snarled. "She's fucking rotting," Preston said. "Do you smell that? That's your daughter." "Shut the fuck up." Mrs. Anderson clutched Cassidy's body closer. "Just shut up. Just let me bury her." "Where?" Preston snapped. "Where the fuck are you going to bury her?" "Just leave her alone," I said, and tried to get between them. And Preston just glared at me. "Why?" he asked. "She was so high and mighty back in the classroom. She's the one who wanted to go to the gym. Look how that fucking turned out. They got into the gym. And they got everyone who tried to get into the gym." "Stop it," Mrs. Anderson rasped. "Preston, please." "It's your fault that she's dead. And I'm not fucking dealing with it," Preston continued. "If you people had just listened to me and gone to the cars like I said. But no. You had to go to the gym. And now everybody's dead." "That's not her fault," I protested. "Bullshit. It is her fault. Now get out of the way. I'm tossing that fucking corpse." "No," Mrs. Anderson screamed, and Preston tried to push past me. "Preston, stop," I cried, but he shoved me out of the way. I slammed against the stall, and I saw his fist coming right for my face. The world went white. I felt myself hit the ground and listened to Mrs. Anderson scream as he tried to wrestle her dead daughter away from her. "I'm not sitting here with a goddamn corpse," he snarled. "Let go of her." Mrs. Anderson's protest was cut off when he struck her. I heard her hitting the ground, followed by the dull thud of Cassidy's body being pulled away. I opened my eyes and started to pick myself up as I saw Preston dragging her to the door. She was unceremoniously tossed out, just like the other dead girl. I caught a glimpse of the black locust buzzing around the corpse of the first girl. "Cassidy, no, please," Mrs. Anderson shrieked. I saw her getting up. Fresh tears were streaming down her cheeks, and she ran for the door, blindly attempting to get her daughter's corpse back. Preston threw another punch straight at her face and sent her to the ground. Her pantyhose were ripped, and her skirt hiked up a little as she fell. "This is your fault. We're in here because of you," Preston murmured. "Because you fucked this up." "No," Mrs. Anderson sobbed. "No." "Preston," I said as I slowly stood up. "Just chill out, man." "Fuck off," he snapped. "Why the fuck are you on her side, huh? What, you think she's gonna protect you? Huh? Is that it?" I was barely to my feet when Preston came for me. He slammed me against the stall, and his fist was driven into my stomach, over and over again. He hit me in the jaw, before throwing me toward the sinks. I collapsed and hit the ground hard. "Stop it!" Mrs. Anderson cried. "Jesus, Preston, stop it!" She was trying to stand, but Preston was on her in an instant. "Not so fucking high and mighty now, are you?" he growled, as he pinned her against the wall. His voice was low and raspy. His eyes traveled along her body. A button on her blouse had burst, and I knew what he was thinking. No. Mrs. Anderson's tone had gone from grief to horror as she realized what Preston was about to do. He pressed her up against the wall and tugged at her skirt. No, stop. I stood up. My entire body hurt, but I wasn't about to let Preston do this. I ran for him, dragging him off of Mrs. Anderson. My arm went around his throat and he backed up, slamming me into the stall again. Preston doubled over, lifting me off the ground and trying to shake me off. God damn it, fuck off, he screeched. Mrs. Anderson put as much distance as she could between us and shimmied toward the door. Her eyes were trained on us. He threw me off of him and kicked me hard in the stomach, screaming incoherently as he did. He only stopped when he heard the bathroom door open. Preston whirled around and looked at the locust-covered corpses of the two girls outside the door. His eyes widened as the locust rose off the corpses like a cloud and flew into the bathroom. Behind him, I could see Mrs. Anderson leering at him, and as the locust fell upon Preston, he stumbled backward. Mrs. Anderson left her position by the door and grabbed me by the hand. She forced me to my feet and pulled me out of the bathroom as Preston screamed in pain behind us. The two of us sprinted down the hall with no direction in mind. There were fewer locusts than there'd been before, and the ones we passed avoided us for the time being. I knew it wouldn't be long until they realized that they could feast on us, though. I looked back to see Preston burst out into the hall. He fell onto all fours before picking himself up and wildly stumbling after us. We ran away from the gym, and as we fled, I spotted corpses in the hall. People who had died when we left the classroom. The classroom. I seized Mrs. Anderson's hand and tugged her arm, beckoning her to follow me. Maybe it was a long shot, but I was hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance that Wiley's classroom was still safe. They'd let us in, right? A locust bit me, but I was too scared to care. The classroom wasn't far. It was just down the hall on the right. We could make it that far, right? Get back here, Preston cried behind us. His voice was garbled. The door was just ahead, and as we reached it, I started pounding on the door. Please, please, just let us in. I saw movement behind the window. I saw a human face and heard the door opening. Mrs. Anderson and I stumbled into the classroom and slammed the door behind us. Moments later, Preston crashed against the door. Don't open it, I cried and pressed myself against it. Don't let him in. Let me in, Preston snarled. His voice was distorted. Let me the fuck in. Through the window, I could see his wild eyes. I could see the blood running down his face as the locust swarmed him. Trevor, he rasped. Let me in. I held the door closed as he pounded on it, and looked him in the eyes as the locust swarmed him. Behind me, I could hear Mrs. Anderson sobbing, and I could hear Claire, the teacher, whispering to her. Oh God, Sarah, we thought you were... Where's Cassidy? Wiley was behind me, looking through the window at Preston, but he didn't try to stop me from keeping him out. Let me in, Preston growled. Fuckers. His legs collapsed out from under him. His eyes were dazed and confused. He wasn't even trying to stop the locust that consumed him. Finally, I watched as the locust began to cover his face. They crawled into his mouth and began to devour his eyes. I looked away as Preston collapsed, thankfully out of my view. A lot of the survivors from the gym and the failed attempt to get to the gym had ended up with Wiley. Wiley later told me that they'd gotten a few spots of internet during the night. From what he'd been able to figure out, there was nothing in the news about locusts in Hampton, Wisconsin. Nobody had called for help. I don't think anyone was able to. We got the internet going a little bit earlier, and we couldn't even fucking find Hampton on a map. Whatever's happening here, it's being covered up. And I don't think anyone is coming for us. I wrote this so that when we get internet again, I can post it to as many places as possible. I'm one of the few people who still has battery on his phone, although not much. Maybe this will get through to someone. Maybe someone will be able to help. I don't want to die here. But we are alone. We are hungry. And I don't think help is coming. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/Jordan Group Horror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.